any chance that I get to talk about the Battle of Shepherdstown is always a great chance, but especially on, as John mentioned, the 163rd anniversary of the Battle of Shepherdstown. And later on this morning, I'm actually going to get to lead a tour crossing the Potomac River. It is not a battle that is as well known, certainly, as the larger battles which preceded it just a few days earlier at Antietam and South Mountain. But this battle is certainly the battle that really helps bring the Maryland campaign of September 1862 to a close. So we're going to run through the whole gamut of the two-day action here at the Battle of Shepherdstown. Now, before we do that, of course, this is a familiar photograph, I'm sure, to many of you taken of dead Confederate soldiers on the Antietam battlefield on September 17th, 1862. But while Alexander Gardner and his crew were taking grisly, horrible photographs like this one of the Antietam battlefield, the Maryland campaign was still going on. And in fact, I'm sure that while Gardner was putting his camera into the ground and photographing scenes like this, he would have been able to easily have heard the fighting that was going on just a few miles away on the banks of the Potomac River, just downstream from Shepherdstown, Virginia. Of course, nowadays it is Shepherdstown, West Virginia, but in September 1862, West Virginia was not yet a state. So I'll refer to it both interchangeably as Shepherdstown, Virginia, and Shepherdstown, West Virginia. But I've always liked this thought of the Battle of Antietam overshadowing the subsequent events, and that so often you'll see in history books of the Maryland campaign or general histories of the Civil War as well. You talk about the Battle of Antietam, bloodiest single day in American military history. Between the two sides, 23,000 casualties over the course of 12 hours. That's one person every 2 seconds for 12 straight hours. Um, but then those general histories usually just say, well, Lee left the battlefield. That is in fact far from the case, because when Robert E. Lee decided to pull his army away from the banks of Antietam Creek, behind the banks of the Potomac River, beginning on the night of September 18th, 1862, Lee was not waving the white flag on his campaign into Maryland. Instead, what Lee sought to do was to move his army away from Sharpsburg, which is where you see that big blue block representing the Army of the Potomac. And Lee would send first his cavalry under the command of Jeb Stuart at a crossing point upstream from Shepherdstown to move on the west bank of the Potomac River, move north, and recross the Potomac River and secure a bridgehead at Williamsport, Maryland, about 12 miles upstream of the Potomac River from Shepherdstown and Sharpsburg. So, in the meantime, while Jeb Stuart's cavalry was securing a crossing point at Williamsport, again, a bridgehead for Lee to potentially move his army back into Maryland, Lee's main body, the infantry and the artillery, would cross at a place called Boatler's Ford downstream from Shepherdstown, swing west toward Martinsburg, then swing north from Martinsburg toward Williamsport, and hopefully, with that bridgehead that his cavalry had secured at Williamsport, Lee's army would be able to move back into Maryland and continue the campaign. Lee's objective, come the morning of September 19th, was to reach the town of Hagerstown, about 12 miles to the north of Sharpsburg, and from there, then again, he would continue his campaign. And the reason Hagerstown was so important to Lee's plans, just like we so often hear about the town of Gettysburg, Hagerstown is a hub of many different roads coming together. In fact, one of the nicknames of Hagerstown is the Hub City because of all these roads coming together and converging from very different points of the compass. So if Lee could have gotten into Hagerstown probably by sometime on September the 20th, again, his withdrawal from Sharpsburg is going to start late on the evening of September 18th, Lee would have several options from Hagerstown. He could either move south, and if he caught George McClellan and the Army of the Potomac by surprise, he would be able to move south and potentially strike its right flank there in the area of Sharpsburg. Lee could move east from Hagerstown toward Washington and Baltimore and continue to threaten those two very important cities to the Federal war effort. Or Lee could also turn north from Hagerstown, move into Pennsylvania perhaps, and then continue his campaign of maneuver from there and continue drawing the Army of the Potomac toward him where he would find a place which to bring it. Known as the Williamsport Plan, it is unfortunately not so well known of a plan, but Robert E. Lee did talk about it three times in correspondence during the course of the Maryland campaign itself. So again, Lee bringing his army out of Maryland, away from Sharpsburg, back across the Potomac River into Virginia, in Lee's mind, is only a temporary movement back into Virginia. Robert E. Lee still very much had his sights set 163 years ago, this moment, on bringing his army back into Maryland and continuing the campaign beyond Antietam Creek. Now, while Lee's army is moving in the direction of Martinsburg, away from Shepherdstown. His army was able to get across successfully. They did leave behind several hundred wounded, a few cannons and other supplies and things like that, but Lee was able to get his army safely back across the Potomac River and into Virginia by the morning of September 19th. Now, again, the main focus of Robert E. Lee is shifting his army away from Shepherdstown and toward Williamsport. But like any good military commander knew, Lee had to leave behind some kind of rear guard at Boteler's Ford, about a mile downstream from Shepherdstown, just in case George McClellan and his Army of the Potomac decided to pursue to the banks of the Potomac River. The man left in charge is a look-alike carbon copy of Robert E. Lee, as you can see from the picture there on the right. That is Lee's chief of artillery, the chief of artillery of the Army of Northern Virginia, William Nelson Pendleton. Pendleton was a graduate of the United States Military Academy a year after Robert E. Lee, so he was at the school at the same time as Jefferson Davis and Robert E. Lee were. But Pendleton did not spend most of his life in the pre-Civil War United States Army. He resigned just 3 years after graduating to become a minister, which are the positions that he held up until the Civil War itself. Now, Pendleton, by the time of September 1862, his star was really starting to fade in the eyes of Robert E. Lee and the other commanders of the Army of Northern Virginia. As you can see with my right up there on the left, at the time of the 7 days in late June and early July of 1862, Pendleton had 27 artillery batteries directly under his command and his control. By the time of the Maryland campaign, there were only 4 batteries that directly reported to Pendleton. And so what you can see in the Confederate High Command is this effort to basically strip Pendleton of having any tactical command on a battlefield itself. As I mentioned, the men who served under Pendleton did not think very highly of him. One of those soldiers that was serving under Pendleton had this to say about the Army of Northern Virginia's chief of artillery. He said, "By the way, Pendleton is Lee's weakness. Pendleton is like the elephant. We have him, and we don't know what on earth to do with him, and it costs a devil of a sight to feed him." So those are not, of course, very laudatory words about William Nelson Pendleton. But nonetheless, Pendleton, as I mentioned, is going to be tasked with protecting the rear of the Army of Northern Virginia at Shepherdstown while the main body of the army was continuing to move toward Martinsburg and then Williamsport beyond. To do that, Pendleton had a scratched together force of 44 artillery pieces and 600 infantry from 2 beaten and battered brigades that were, as of September 17th, 1862, Georgians under the command of Marcellus Douglas. Douglas was killed during the fighting on September 17th, and Virginians under the command of Lewis Armistead. Armistead had been wounded in the fighting on the 17th, so he was not present here at Shepherdstown. But again, it's a very, very small force. And despite that, Robert E. Lee, in my opinion, I think, and he would write about this later on after the Civil War, believed that despite the beating that the Confederate Army had taken at Antietam on September 17th, he believed that the Confederate Army had given just as good as it got. And so he believed the Federal Army was in no position to be able to pursue all the way to the banks of the Potomac River. And that is perhaps why Lee tasked Pendleton with this job of protecting the rear of the Confederate Army and why it was a relatively small force that was protecting the crossing there about a mile downstream from Shepherdstown. Um, Now, one other thing to consider is that despite the fact that Lee probably did not have any thoughts that the Federal Army would pursue toward the Potomac River, Lee left Pendleton with very, very detailed instructions. And what those instructions essentially said were to hold out until nightfall there at Boatler's Ford, regardless of whether federal troops tried getting across the river, if the Federals bring up artillery and cavalry, whatever it might be. Lee told Pendleton to hold out until nightfall, and that's going to come into play later on with the story as we get into the night of September 19th, 1862. So just tuck that away in the back of your mind. Now, sure enough, come the morning of the sun began to rise on the Antietam battlefield. George McClellan's infantry began to move forward, and they found pretty quickly that the Confederate Army was no longer in its positions outside of Sharpsburg. And so McClellan turned to his cavalry chief, Alfred Pleasonton, to begin moving west from Sharpsburg in the direction of the Potomac River to figure out where the Confederate Army had gone. As Pleasonton's cavalry in the advance began moving west along the Shepherdstown Pike, they crested the bluffs overlooking the Potomac River on the Maryland side of the river, and in particular came to a hill called Ferry Hill. And they immediately started to come under fire from William Nelson Pendleton's rear guard and those guns posted on the south side of the Potomac River. Pleasanton brought up his own guns. This is a view, excuse me, looking from Ferry Hill, the position of Pleasanton's artillery. Obviously, a modern view. Though I did not take this photo yesterday, it is not snowing in West Virginia in September. This was taken several years ago, but I like with the leaves being off the trees, you can see the battlefield a little bit better. So you'll see a lot of snow in these images that I'm going to show you. But Pleasanton began to engage Pendleton's artillery, get the upper hand. And so Pleasanton ended up calling for help from George McClellan, and McClellan would send first the Union Sixth Corps, and then he would turn them around and send them up toward Williamsport because of information he had received, correct information, of course, that Jeb Stuart's cavalry, as McClellan knew it, he just knew it was Confederate troops, had crossed the Potomac River at Williamsport. So McClellan began sending the Sixth Corps up toward Williamsport, and instead it became the task now of Fitz Porter's Union Fifth Corps to take over the fighting at Shepherdstown itself. So when Porter arrived on the early afternoon of September 19th, he replaced Pleasanton. Pleasanton's guns were pulled away. His cavalry was sent back toward Sharpsburg, toward its camps, and it now became the fight of the Fifth Corps. Even though the federal command changed at Shepherdstown, one thing that did not change were the orders that George McClellan gave first to Alfred Pleasanton and then to Fitz-John Porter. And those orders were not to cross the Potomac River unless first Pleasanton and then Porter saw an opportunity to do damage to the Confederates on the south side of the Potomac River. Without afternoon, Porter began bringing up more artillery batteries, as you can see on the map. While his infantry was behind the guns were posted on the bluffs on the north bank of the Potomac River. They began to engage Pendleton's artillery, and they really started at this point to get the upper hand of the Confederate artillery. In fact, William Nelson Pendleton would write after this event at Shepherdstown that compared to the Federal guns, our guns were like pop guns. So they really weren't able to do anything against the superior numbers and weight of the Federal artillery that was posted on the north shore of the Potomac River. Now, it wasn't just artillery that would become engaged here from the Federal side, as you can see on the map. Fitz-John Porter was slowly feeding infantry down into the dry bed of the Chesapeake and Ohio Canal that runs along the north shore of the Potomac River. And those Federal infantrymen were able to use the canal bed as a breastwork of sorts. And from their positions in the canal bed, they were able to start picking off some of the Confederate gunners that were posted on the south. Now, as this artillery duel continued to drag on and continued throughout the day of September 19th, William Nelson Pendleton was beginning to find himself in a difficult situation. Again, his orders were to hold out until nightfall. However, as Pendleton's guns continued to fire, many of his guns started to run low or even run out of ammunition. And so, what Pendleton was faced with is having many of his battery commanders telling him, "We're out of ammunition. What do you want us to do?" And here's where Pendleton found himself between a rock and a hard place. Pendleton basically had two options at this point. His first option was he could start, because they had no ammunition to shoot back, he could begin pulling his guns away from Boteler's Ford. But again, his orders were to wait until nightfall. And also, Pendleton feared that if the Federal troops on the north side of the river saw his guns pulling away, that would serve as an incentive to the Federal infantry to charge across the river. Pendleton's other option, which is the option that he settled on, was to simply tell his battery commanders, even if you don't have ammunition, just maintain your positions on the south side of the river. Even if you can't shoot back, keep your guns in position. Because, of course, he did not want there to be an incentive for the Federals to come across the Potomac River. Now, I don't really fault Pendleton for this, but what he did not consider is that keeping guns in position that were not shooting would also serve as an incentive to the Federals to begin making their way across the Potomac River. And so by dusk of September 19th, Porter had put together a force of about 400 men inside of the canal. There's a view today from the bed of the C&O Canal looking across the Potomac River toward Shepherdstown. And sensing an opportunity at about dusk, Porter ordered about 400 men, consisting of the 1st United States Sharpshooters and the 4th Michigan Infantry, to form up into a line of battle on the towpath of the canal and charge across the Potomac River and try to scatter the Confederate rear guard and capture as many of the guns as he possibly could. This is, of course, Fitz John Porter on the right. The man who was in charge of the 4th Michigan and who led this charge across the Potomac River is the man you see on the left, Colonel Jonathan Childs. One member of the 4th Michigan Infantry had this to say about the events of September 19th. He said, "About sundown, the colonel told us we were about to perform a bold thing, namely take the battery upon the bluff opposite, commanding the ford. He asked if we were willing. A universal yes showed that we were ready for most anything. Throwing off our extra traps, we filed down to the river and into the canal, now empty, and there formed for the charge. I made up my mind that that was the last time I should see the sun set, but it was the order, and duty said go." And so both of the United States and a few scattered elements of other regiments in the Federal Fifth Corps began making their way across the river, just downstream from the ford itself. So, unfortunately for the sharpshooters and the Michigan men, many of the men did not hit the ford exactly, and so as they charged down into the Potomac River, water came up to their necks in many cases, so it was very difficult crossing. Fortunately for them, though, by the time they started coming across, most of Pendleton's infantry and his artillery was starting to pull back to the rear. And so in this charge across the river, there were very few Federal casualties. The 4th Michigan only suffered 7 losses in the course of their charge across the Potomac River. This is a post-war sketch of that charge across the river. It's a little bit of a glorified and fancified sketch, but it shows just how open the bluffs were. And I have some other pictures later on in the presentation showing just how open the bluffs were where the Confederate artillery was posted. Now, this charge worked out brilliantly. It was exactly what McClellan had planned when he gave those orders to Pleasanton and Porter not to dash across the Potomac River unless they saw an opportunity to do damage to the enemy without, of course, incurring much damage to themselves. So not only were they able to scatter the rear guard of Pendleton's command, but they also managed to capture 4 artillery pieces. And we'll get to that. This is a Shepherdstown. And basically, to sum it up for you, I'll give you a little bit of time to read that if you like. But to sum it up for you, what he said is that as Pendleton was behind the lines, and as these federal forces were charging across the Potomac River, Pendleton started to see Confederate artillery, infantrymen panicked, running for the rear, running away from the river itself. And so Pendleton felt that he could not expose himself to capture, and so without ensuring that his rear guard was able to get away from the Potomac River, he simply left and he began riding for the rear looking for assistance. Now, Pendleton was under the impression that what had happened back at the Potomac River Ford, back at Butler's Ford, was much worse than what was actually the case. So, in Pendleton's mind, as far as he knew, all 44 guns of the Confederate rear guard at Butler's Ford had been captured by the Federal infantry that had made its way across the Potomac River. So throughout the late night into the early morning of September 19th to the 20th of 1862, William Nelson Pendleton was riding through the Confederate lines looking for help. He came upon Roger Pryor, who was appointed to command of Richard Anderson's division following Anderson's wounding on September 17th. And Pendleton asked Pryor for help. Pryor couldn't do anything to help him. Pendleton kept riding. He found John Bell Hood next, asked Hood for help. Hood said that he wouldn't be able to help him at all. Pendleton found D.H. Hill. He found Osmond Latrobe, who was on D.R. Jones's staff. Finally, he found Stonewall Jackson, asking for help, asking for anything, and most importantly, asking to find out where the Army commander was, Robert E. Lee. And by the time Pendleton found Jackson, probably at about midnight from September 19th into the morning of September 20th, Jackson informed Pendleton that Jackson's camp was very close to Robert E. Lee's camp. And so Pendleton, again, probably at about midnight or shortly thereafter, showed up at the tent of the Army commander, Robert E. Lee. Now, this was perhaps the first night and many nights that Robert E. Lee was getting a few consecutive hours of rest. He had successfully moved his army across the Potomac River. His army was beginning to swing west toward Martinsburg so that they could get back into Maryland. And here comes William Nelson Pendleton in the middle of the night to wake up Robert E. Lee. And Lee stumbled out of his tent, probably wiping the sleep from his eyes. And Pendleton informed Lee that all 44 guns of the artillery reserve had been captured at Shepherdstown. And Lee was so dumbfounded, and Pendleton could only reply, "Yes, General, I fear all." Lee's response supposedly was, "Well, there's no more that we can do about this now. We will have to wait until the morning." And so Pendleton went to go sleep on a pile of hay, the general's tent, and fell asleep. In the meantime, though, Lee was beginning to put the wheels in motion. Robert E. Lee, clouded by the fog of war, did not know that, of course, it was only a force of 400 Federal soldiers that had crossed the Potomac River. And with the information that he had been given to him by Pendleton, that all 44 guns of the reserve artillery had been captured, Lee had to assume that it was a very large Federal force that had crossed in his rear. With a large Federal force in his rear, and so early on the morning of September 20th, Robert E. Lee decided to turn his army around, put the brakes on the movement toward Williamsport, turn his army around, and send it back to Shepherdstown to deal with the threat in his rear. Night of September 19th, did not capture 44 guns. They had only managed to capture 4 guns. That was it. Pendleton's subordinates had been able to get the rest of the guns off the field. Now, again, Pendleton and Robert E. Lee did not know this. Now, the Federal troops that crossed the Potomac River that night were under the command, they were part of the brigade, under the command of Charles Griffin, the man that you see there on the left. And while I was researching the Battle of Shepherdstown, one of the stories that you will often hear is that as one of those captured Confederate guns was brought back across the Potomac River to the Federal side, Charles Griffin immediately captured from his battery atop Henry Hill during the Battle of First Manassas on July 21st, 1861. So as I was researching in the Library of Congress years ago, I was going through Henry Hunt's papers, who was the chief of artillery of the Army of the Potomac, and I found this document that you see on the right side of your screen. It had all the markings of the gun that Griffin had lost at First Manassas and he had found at Shepherdstown. And I thought this is such a cool document. I had never seen anything like this. And I thought, with all this information, how many times have you all been out to a Civil War battlefield and you look at the markings on the cannons and think, wouldn't it be cool to figure out what's the story of this cannon? What battery did it belong to? What battle did it see action in? And things like that. And I thought it would be so cool. I wonder if this cannon was still around. Well, for years, could never really find a lead on it at all until when I was studying for some final test or something like that at Shepherd's Library. A friend of mine showed me this great big book that has a listing of every known Civil War cannon in the country, original Civil War cannon, and where it is. And so immediately I went through this book and I was looking for, you can see the gun number at the bottom of that page, gun number two, an 1861 model 10-pound Parrott rifle. And sure enough, much to my surprise, gun number two still exists. I grew up in Western New York, up near Buffalo, and I found out that gun number two was part of a Civil War memorial that was probably 30 minutes from where I grew up. And so, of course, the next time I went home, I immediately made sure to stop and see gun number two that had been captured by Charles Griffin's men. And here's a full version of it. As you can see, they were just getting ready to celebrate Christmas. Well, I took this photograph, but gun number two is still there. Now, the cool thing is this gun was put back into Battery D of the 5th United States Artillery. If you know much about the history of that battery, they found themselves atop Little Round Top on July 2nd, 1863. This gun I can't prove with 100% certainty, but I am almost positive that this particular gun was still with Battery D of U.S. Artillery on July 2nd, 1863. It was recaptured at Shepherdstown, September 1862, and was on top of Little Round Top at Gettysburg in July of 1863. So just a really cool and incredible story. I always love sharing that story of gun number two. Now the events at Shepherdstown were not over. Come the morning of September 20th, Fitz John Porter, no doubt happy with his success of the previous night, received permission from George McClellan to move troops across the Potomac River the next morning in larger force, several brigades at this point, rather than just several regiments, to move across the Potomac River into Virginia and basically do a reconnaissance to figure out exactly where the Confederate Army had gone. So this movement would be under the command of George Sykes, who commanded one of the divisions of the Fifth Corps. And as you can see, Sykes's division was tasked with moving directly south from Boatler's Ford from the Potomac River into Virginia to figure out if where the Confederate Army had gone in that direction. And another division that would cross after Sykes under the command of George Morrell was instructed to move west toward Shepherdstown itself and move in that direction again. Just figure out, try to find out where the Confederate Army had gone. So come early the morning of September 20th, almost 163 years ago, right now, Federal soldiers began making their way across the Potomac River. Now, this was infantry alone. There was no Federal cavalry that was accompanying this movement. The reason for that, despite them being ordered to be at the river that night, or excuse me, that morning, to screen the infantry advance, when Porter had taken Pleasonton's cavalry and sent them back to their camps, in the process of doing that, as the cavalry was moving back to their camps, they passed, just like ships in the night, they passed their supply trains. And so the supply trains were late getting forage for the horses to Pleasonton's cavalrymen. And so the cavalry, the Federal cavalry, did not show up at the river at daylight like they had been ordered to. And so it was infantry going into Virginia alone come the morning of September 20th. About a mile south of Boatler's Ford, George Sykes's troops ran into the vanguard of Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia that again had turned around and was making its way back toward Shepherdstown. This was the division, perhaps one of the best divisions of the Army of Northern Virginia, and that was the division of A.P. Hill. Toward the Potomac River under fire of federal artillery that was posted on the north shore of the Potomac and began driving those federal troops back. George Sykes recognized that fighting with a river and bluffs, we'll get more to those in just a second, directly at his back was no good place to fight a battle. And so Sykes began ordering his troops to pull back to Boteler's Ford to try to slow down the Confederate advance, pull back toward Boteler's Ford, and get back across the Potomac River to safety. So this is a reconnaissance. They have figured out that the Confederates are in force in front of them, and Sykes and Porter have now called off the reconnaissance to move back toward the north bank of the Potomac River. This is a view, again, no snow in September 1862, but a view today of the fields that the Confederates advanced across about a mile south of the ford. Of course, here is A.P. Hill, as I mentioned, one of the best division commanders in the Army of Northern Virginia, commanding probably the best division. You can see what Robert E. Lee had to say of A.P. Hill, that he considered him next to Jackson and Longstreet the best commander with me. And so Hill is the perfect man for the job to make sure that the federal incursion into the rear of the Army of Northern Virginia was not going to be a problem that would stick with Robert E. Lee and derail his plans of re-entering Maryland. Now, as Sykes began pulling Lovell's brigade, Charles Lovell's brigade, that's the brigade of United States regulars, back away from A.P. Hill's men and back toward the Potomac River, he diverted the movement of George Morrell's division, which was led by James Barnes's brigade. Again, their task is to move west toward Shepherdstown. Sykes instead ordered Barnes to get his men up onto the bluffs to help cover the withdrawal of Lovell's brigade from the face of A.P. Hill's division and back across the Potomac River and back to safety. And so this is what you can see there on the map. Barnes's brigade is going to begin deploying on the bluffs to, again, not to fight a battle, but simply just to screen and protect the withdrawal of Lovell's brigade back across Boteler's Ford. Here is James Barnes. This was his first time commanding a brigade on the battlefield. His brigade consisted of about 1,700 men. It was six veteran regiments that had suffered heavy casualties during the 7 Days battles. And there was one new regiment that we'll talk about quite a bit. That was the 118th Pennsylvania. They had been in the Army for about 3 weeks. 737 men filled the ranks of the 118th Pennsylvania. And so here you can see Barnes's brigade has now deployed onto the bluffs above the Potomac River to again screen the withdrawal of Lovell's men. And pretty much you can see that Gouverneur Warren's brigade also came across. Almost as soon as they came across, they would be ordered to begin making their way back across the ford. And again, hopefully, in the mind of George Sykes and Fitz John Porter of the Potomac River. This is Charles Prevost. He was colonel of the 118th Pennsylvania. He had served with Porter in Robert Patterson's army at the start of during the first Manassas campaign. Patterson had commanded troops in the Shenandoah Valley at that time, and so Prevost had served with Porter. I'm not sure how much of a connection they actually had, but they certainly probably would have known each other at least a little bit from the start of the war. Now, nonetheless, Barnes's brigade was fully deployed at about 10 a.m. on the morning of September 20th. Just as soon as they became fully deployed, that's when orders were given to start pulling Lovell's brigade back across Boteler's Ford, pulling Warren's brigade back across Boteler's Ford, and then once Barnes determined that those troops had safely made their way back across the Potomac River, Barnes began to give orders for the rest of his brigade to start pulling back also, disengage from the Confederates, and begin making their way back across the Potomac River. Let me go back one here real quick. Um, Barnes had told one of his staff officers that Barnes himself would personally deliver orders to the units that you see there on the left end of his line, the 2nd Maine, the 18th and 22nd Massachusetts, the 1st Michigan. He would give orders to those units to begin pulling back off the bluffs. He then dispatched one of his staff officers to go and give orders to the units on the right end of the line. That's how it was described to the staff officer to pull the units back on the right end of the line. So that would be the 25th New York and the 13th New York. Officer rode to those two New York regiments. He gave them the orders to pull back across the Potomac River to get back into Maryland. And as he was making his way, as you're looking at it on the screen, from our left to right, so west to east, back toward Boteler's Ford, he noticed that the men of the 118th Pennsylvania were deployed and were beginning to become seriously engaged with the Confederate forces of Dorsey Pender's brigade in their front. That staff officer rode up to the men of the 118th Pennsylvania, shouted to one of the lieutenants that he found of the Pennsylvania Regiment Barnes's orders to pull back across the Potomac River, and then that staff officer went on his way. The lieutenant of the 118th Pennsylvania who heard this passed the message along to Colonel Charles Prevost, and Prevost's response was, "Who did you hear these orders from?" And the man replied that it was from one of Barnes's staff officers. And Prevost's response to that was, "I do not take orders in that way." And so the 118th Pennsylvania, again, a brand new unit, never been engaged in battle before, they stayed alone on the bluffs downstream from Shepherdstown. They began to attract, as you can see, the Confederate forces. The second line of Hill's division began to swarm around the men of the 118th Pennsylvania. Charles Prevost was wounded during the action. To make matters even worse for the Green soldiers of the 118th Pennsylvania, some of their Enfield rifles that they had been given at the start of their service were faulty and were not working. And so they were not able to shoot back. Some of the men were not able to shoot back at the Confederate troops in front of them. This is a view looking from the knoll where the 118th Pennsylvania was positioned, looking out toward the fields through which A.P. Hill's division, especially Dorsey Pender's North Carolina Brigade, advanced. This is a view of the bluffs. This is a picture taken shortly after the Civil War. I know it's not the best quality, but you can see the line of bluffs in the distance. I think I've got a more, yeah, here's a better photograph of them. Even still, those bluffs were at the back of the 118th Pennsylvania. Eventually, James Barnes gave orders to Prevost second across the Potomac River. Doing so, however, was no easy feat, as you can imagine, because those Pennsylvanians, while under fire, had to navigate those tricky bluffs. Here's a modern day view of what those bluffs look like. And many of the men simply jumped down the bluffs. They were sliding down the bluffs. It was a very, very chaotic and disorderly retreat from those bluffs to get back to the Potomac River itself. Here's more. You can see the Confederate troops making their way, looping their way around, almost getting in the rear of the 118th Pennsylvania. That was just further making the efforts of those Pennsylvanians to try and get away even more and more difficult. Here's another view from the top of the bluffs where the 118th Pennsylvania were. You could see sort of toward the bottom left of the image, there's a big boulder that you'll see on the left there. And just to the right of that boulder, you can actually see the road which existed at the time of the battle. It's known as the River Road today. And you can see just how high those bluffs are. And again, how tricky it would have been for those Pennsylvanians to get down those bluffs and to make their way back across the Potomac River. It was a very, very chaotic retreat. Most of the Pennsylvanians did not even get to the ford itself because that was covered by the fire of the Confederate infantry. So many of the Pennsylvanians instead crossed here. There was a mill dam that had been built across the Potomac River to help provide water to the cement mill that was built on the south side of the Potomac River. You can see just above the bottom of the blue arrow there, some of those lime kilns that are part of that cement mill that are still on the battlefield today. Um, Pennsylvanians began again dashing across the mill dam for safety. As they were doing so, Confederate bullets were shooting up spouts of water in their faces. Bullets were hitting pieces of the dam. Bullets were hitting some of the Pennsylvanians as they made their way across the Potomac River and back to safety. Unfortunately, one of the lieutenants of the 118th Pennsylvania, the gentleman pictured down there below, J. Rudhall White was his name. As the story goes, he dashed across the mill dam to the Maryland shore as fast, and as soon as he uttered those words, a bullet passed through his groin out the other side, and he was dead very shortly thereafter, one of the many casualties of the Battle of Shepherdstown. Um, some of the Pennsylvanians, not wanting to risk their lives, made their way for safety. They didn't want to risk their lives running across the mill dam and potentially getting shot. They hid in some of the archways of the cement mill that, as I mentioned, are still there today. This is a photograph of those archways. There was federal artillery that was posted on the north side of the Potomac River that was trying to engage the Confederates and get the Confederates basically to keep their heads down and prevent them from shooting on the Pennsylvanians as they were dashing across. Unfortunately, one federal artillery shell fell short, and it landed right in the one of those archways and exploded and killed as many, perhaps as many as 9 soldiers of the 118th Pennsylvania who were huddled in those lime kilns for safety. Of course, they ended up unfortunately becoming victims of friendly fire. Um, with that, really, once the 118th Pennsylvania was able to make their way across, the Battle of Shepherdstown came to an end. Ironically, for a campaign that can certainly be viewed and should be viewed as a Union victory, the last Battle of the Maryland campaign was a Confederate victory. Instead, Confederate troops, A.P. Hill's division, had successfully ended the incursion into the rear of the Confederate army. Now, as you can see, the casualty counts here, about 700 casualties between the two sides, though a large portion, especially on the federal side, of the casualties came from the men of the 118th Pennsylvania. They suffered 270 losses. That was almost 75% of all federal casualties came from that one regiment, and 40% of all battle casualties came from the 118th Pennsylvania itself. Now, in the aftermath of all this, the next day, one soldier of the 118th Pennsylvania by the name of Lemuel Crocker, the large burly man that you see on the right side of your screen, made his way across under an unofficial flag of truce, began making his way across the Potomac River to gather up his dead comrades of the 118th Pennsylvania and begin moving them back and forth across the Potomac River. It's really an incredible feat of bravery and heroism. The Confederate troops let him do it once they figured out what he was doing. But because this was not done under any official flag of truce or anything like that, Crocker was told several times that if he continued on his mission of mercy, that Fitz John Porter would order the federal guns to open and to shell him and to fire on him. And supposedly Crocker's response to that was shell and be damned. And he continued on his errand of mercy to bring as many of the dead bodies, dead officers of the 118th Pennsylvania back to the north bank of the Potomac River. Later on, Crocker would be read the Riot Act by Fitz John Porter, but then eventually basically let off scot-free, despite him going and doing this without orders and making his way into Confederate lines and crossing the Potomac River. Um, Now, for the larger picture of why the Battle of Shepherdstown matters, in the process of halting his movement toward Williamsport and turning his army back around and sending it back toward Shepherdstown, that he had simply run the wheels off of his army. Over the course of 3 months of campaigning, during the 7 Days Campaign, the Second Manassas Campaign, and the Maryland Campaign, now finally Lee saw that his army was in no condition to move toward Williamsport and renew the campaign into Maryland. And so, following the Battle of Shepherdstown, recognizing that, Lee, as he wrote in his after action report of the campaign, said, as you can see there on the left, the condition of our troops now demanded repose. And rather than moving his army north from Martinsburg toward Williamsport, Lee instead decided to move his army south from Martinsburg toward the vicinity of Bunker Hill and Winchester, where the army would lick its wounds, it would begin to reorganize, and would prepare for the next campaign. On the other side of the Potomac River, George McClellan also realized that his army was exhausted. Both these armies had suffered extensive casualties during the fighting on September 17th. Antietam. And the Battle of Shepherdstown showed George McClellan that they were still a very dangerous foe to deal with. And so George McClellan and Robert E. Lee both, almost as if by mutual consent, which of course it was not, but both decided to keep their armies on their respective sides of the Potomac River. And following the Battle of Shepherdstown, both armies would spend about 6 weeks reorganizing, resupplying, and refitting, and reinforcing themselves by gathering in stragglers, sick, wounded, etc., for the next campaign. But the Battle of Shepherdstown brought an end to the 1862 Maryland campaign, and the campaign did not end along the banks of Antietam Creek, but instead along the banks of the Potomac River on the morning of September 20th, 1862. Thank you all very much, and I'll be happy to answer any questions that you all might have.